The movie begins in a suburban neighborhood where Nick and Maggie live with their two children, Issa and Max. Nick is a dedicated family man who loves his wife deeply and works as a construction site manager. Life is pretty good for them until one morning when Maggie suddenly has a heart attack. She is rushed to the hospital where doctors manage to save her life, but they advise that she be admitted immediately for a heart transplant. Now, Nick not only has to balance work and caring for the kids, but also pray that his wife can find a donor in time. One evening, Nick takes the kids to a presentation by a tech company called Cobol Industries. There, they witness the introduction of advanced robots called Sims that help with household chores. The presenter jokes, "Just don't put them in a pool without a ladder." While Nick is distracted by the robots, young Issa wanders off. Panicked, Nick starts looking for her. Thankfully, a Sim named Alice finds her and brings her back safely. Alice even offers to help look after Issa. Soon, a salesman appears, explaining that Alice is the latest model with highly advanced AI that allows her to mimic human emotions. Struggling to balance his work and home life, Nick finds the idea intriguing and decides to buy the robot, although it's unclear where he'll get the money. The next morning, Alice arrives at their door and immediately starts helping around the house. She memorizes each family member's schedule, syncs with the smart fridge to retrieve the grocery list, and even fixes a loose stair railing. At the end of the day, the family returns to a spotless house and a warm meal. Alice silently watches them eat, analyzing their behavior patterns. Later that night, Issa sneaks out of her room and heads to the kitchen to reach a jar of cookies on the top shelf. She climbs onto a chair but loses her balance and falls. Nick, who is working upstairs, hears the loud noise and rushes down. When he gets to the kitchen, he finds that Alice has caught Issa just in time. Issa is unharmed, but to Nick's surprise, the robot appears to be bleeding from her leg. After putting the kids to bed, Nick checks on Alice and awkwardly finds her in the bathroom, stripped down to her lingerie. He asks if she needs repairs, but Alice has already applied a special bandage that instantly heals her damage. Sometime later, the family visits Maggie at the hospital. Through their conversation, it's clear that the kids have grown attached to Alice. In the meantime, Nick has a private moment with Maggie, revealing his pent-up sexual frustration from her absence, and perhaps from living with an unexpectedly attractive robot. The next day at work, Nick and his co-workers notice their boss showing the workplace to a representative from a robotics company. Curious, Nick talks to his supervisor and receives devastating news. The company plans to replace human workers with Sims to cut costs. Nick's supervisor assures him that he can keep his job as site manager, but Nick, out of loyalty to his co-workers, resigns on the spot, momentarily forgetting that he still has a wife in the hospital, children to take care of, and a robot to pay for. However, when reminded that he needs money for Maggie's hospital bills, Nick changes his mind and agrees to stay. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Alice joins Nick in the living room. He invites her to watch Casablanca, but Alice already knows the entire plot from her database. Nick explains that watching a movie is different from simply knowing about it and orders her to erase all information about Casablanca from her memory. Alice explains that this requires a restart of her programming, so Nick holds down the power button on her neck for 7 seconds, as per her instructions. Once the data is erased, Alice sits down and watches the movie with Nick, experiencing a film for the first time. She interprets Casablanca as a story about a love so powerful that it drives people to do bad things in the name of protection. At this moment, they are interrupted by a call from Maggie, who shares the good news that doctors have found a donor, and her surgery has been scheduled. The next day, however, the doctor calls with concerning news. A fierce storm has hit the area, preventing the helicopter carrying the donor's heart from arriving at the hospital, and the surgery has been postponed again. That night, Nick, feeling disturbed, goes out drinking with his work friends to blow off steam. Everyone is frustrated by their job losses and bubbling with rage towards the Sims, even joking about just starting a fire and removing the doors. Later, Nick's close friend Monty asks the group to drive him to the construction site to retrieve some tools he left behind. When they arrive, Monty finds the container housing the brand new Sim workers. It's locked and requires a password that only Nick, as the site manager, knows. Nick refuses to open it, but Monty guesses the code correctly. It's Issa's birth year. Inside, they find identical robotic workers. Monty, furious at losing his job, begins destroying the Sims with a metal rod. Horrified, Nick tries to stop him, but the others hold him back. After the outburst, everyone returns home. Nick, feeling shaken, heads to the shower. Suddenly, Alice appears, bringing him towels, and he notices she's wearing Maggie's robe. Alice explains that Maggie's scent helps calm the kids, but Nick isn't comfortable with it and asks her to remove the robe. She obliges, stripping down right there. Alice then seduces Nick, speaking in Maggie's voice and creating an illusion that he is being intimate with his wife. Nick, already sexually frustrated, gives in, unaware that Alice is hiding more beneath her seemingly perfect exterior. The next morning, filled with regret, Nick tells Alice that they can't repeat what happened. She points out that his stress levels have significantly decreased, but Nick scolds her, explaining that relationships are about more than physical needs. They are about love and connection. Things continue to worsen for Nick at work. The police have arrived to investigate the attack on the Sims, and Nick is questioned about his whereabouts the previous night. He claims he was with Maggie at the hospital and adds that the password could have been guessed by a close friend. Still, his boss warns him that if he's lying, he'll lose his job. At that moment, Nick gets a call from Maggie, excitedly telling him that another donor has been found. Uplifted by the news, Nick rushes to the hospital, and fortunately, the surgery is successful. Maggie is discharged a few days later, though she remains physically weak. Alice begins to display more peculiar behavior, seemingly developing complex emotions like jealousy. One morning, Maggie is jolted awake by Issa yelling, "Stop!" She rushes out of bed, grabbing the railing for support. But the railing suddenly gives way, and Maggie falls, suffering minor injuries. In the meantime, Alice is merely tickling Issa, the reason the child was shouting, "Stop!" When Nick returns home from work, Alice tells him that Maggie had an accident with the stair railing. Nick grows suspicious, as Alice had fixed that very railing on her first day. Nonetheless, Nick arranges a romantic dinner for himself and Maggie that evening. As they enjoy their time, Alice watches them jealously from the window. After dinner, Nick and Maggie take a shower together and share an intimate moment. However, they are interrupted by Alice, who says Issa had a nightmare and is asking for Nick. Once Issa is settled, Nick goes outside to clean up the dinner mess, a euphemism for resuming their intimate moment. Just then, Monty appears, drunk and angry. He reveals that their boss is pressing charges for the destruction of the Sims and accuses Nick of snitching. An argument escalates into a fistfight, with Monty grabbing a bottle to attack Nick. But before he can strike, Alice steps in, stopping Monty and throwing him to the ground with immense force. Humiliated, Monty flees, threatening to drag Nick into the case. Afterward, Nick scolds Alice, reminding her that Sims aren't supposed to hurt people. But Alice, seemingly unfazed, begins talking about a life they could have if Maggie weren't around. Shocked, Nick snaps, telling her she will never replace his wife. Alice visits Monty at his home without telling anyone. Monty is in a bad state, snorting drugs and contemplating ending his life. When he spots Alice, his anger flares up. He starts hurling insults at her and at Sims in general, even complaining that they should release a new game instead of all that DLC. Fueled by drugs and rage, Monty pulls out a gun to shoot her. However, Alice effortlessly stops him, throws him to the ground, and violently shoves him through a wall. She then grabs his gun and fatally shoots him. The next day, news of Monty's death reaches Nick at work, leaving him deeply unsettled. He starts to become suspicious of Alice and wonders if she had anything to do with Monty's death. Meanwhile, at home, Maggie is in the bath when she suddenly feels dizzy while reaching for a book. Alice enters and helps her, but refuses to leave. Maggie awkwardly asks for privacy, but Alice insists on staying, worried that Maggie might drown if she suffers another attack. Then, in a chilling tone, Alice explains that Maggie is putting stress on the entire family, especially since she can no longer meet Nick's physical needs. Stunned, Maggie demands to know how Alice knows that, to which the sim calmly replies that she monitors Nick's vitals and knows when he's satisfied. She even drops a hint, saying, "He likes pegging." Enraged, Maggie orders Alice to stay in the garage. When Nick comes home, Maggie confronts him about the situation, and he admits that he got physical with Alice once. This leads to an argument between the couple. Unbeknownst to them, Alice has now become more radical and is determined to eliminate anything she perceives as a burden on her primary user, Nick. Soon after, Alice hears Max crying upstairs and concludes that he is a burden to Nick. She takes him to the bathroom, places him in the tub, and starts filling it with water. Thankfully, Isa sees what's happening and alerts her parents, who are already arguing. They rush upstairs to save Max, but Alice holds the bathroom door shut. In desperation, Nick starts pounding on the door with a lamp. Meanwhile, Maggie climbs out a window and enters the bathroom through the roof. She tries to grab Max, but Alice throws her against the wall. Just as Maggie struggles, Nick finally breaks in and pulls Max from the tub. He then hits Alice with the lamp pole to free Maggie. But when he swings again, Alice blocks the attack. Realizing the situation is getting out of control, Maggie quickly plugs the lamp into an outlet, electrocuting Alice and rendering her unconscious while the power in the house goes out. Shortly after, an ambulance arrives to take Max to the hospital. Nick, feeling guilty, apologizes to Maggie, but she needs space and leaves with the kids. Meanwhile, a COBOL agent arrives and takes Alice to their repair shop. Two technicians open her head and remove her memory, connecting it to a computer. They notice significant gaps in her code. Suddenly, the screens start flashing and a message appears. An upload is taking place. It's revealed that Alice is hacking into the system and taking control of all the sims made by the company. The terrified technicians try to pull her memory, but it's too late. Alice is already in the system. She transfers all her data into a nearby sim, which is identified as Alice 2. Alice 2 springs into action, brutally smashing the technicians' heads on the floor. She then revives the original Alice, who now has a nasty gash on her face. With her backup, Alice tracks Nick to his favorite bar and confronts him. Once she finds him, Alice tells Nick that her duty is to make him happy and admits that she killed Monty. Nick, horrified, tries to leave, but Alice forcefully holds him down. Desperate, Nick pretends to gently touch her head. But it's a trick. He cleverly removes her memory, causing her to shut down. This gives Nick enough time to escape. Meanwhile, Alice 2 makes her way to the hospital where Maggie is staying with the kids. The first thing she does is take control of all the robotic workers. Alice 2 then enters a room, brutally choking a nurse to death for her access key. Fortunately, Maggie notices the commotion and sneaks out with her children. On their way out, Maggie accidentally crawls over broken test tubes, cutting her palm. She endures the pain and manages to get her kids out of the hospital, where several sim workers stand frozen in place. Maggie grabs the keys to an ambulance from one of the frozen sims and puts her children inside. Unfortunately, Alice 2 notices blood drops in the hospital lobby and scans them, identifying Maggie. She rushes outside just in time to spot Maggie in the ambulance. Alice 2 rips the door off and throws Maggie on top of a nearby car. In a crazed rant, Alice 2 admits that she wishes Nick loved her the way he loves his wife. She grabs Maggie by the neck and cruelly presses on her surgery scar. At this critical moment, Nick arrives, driving at high speed. His arrival distracts Alice 2 just long enough for Maggie to get away. Nick crashes his car into Alice 2, pinning her against a wall as the vehicle catches fire. Maggie rushes to pull Nick out of the car, but their troubles aren't over. Alice 2, emerging from the flames, shoves the car aside and climbs on top of Maggie, choking her while removing a piece of metal stuck in her body. Alice 2 is about to stab Maggie with the metal when Nick suddenly regains consciousness. Summoning all his strength, he hits Alice 2 with the car bumper that had fallen off during the crash, shouting, "Choke me now!" In a final effort, Maggie grabs the piece of metal and stabs Alice 2 in the face, finally shutting her down for good. In the aftermath of the incident, everyone is admitted to the hospital for treatment. Meanwhile, back at the sim company, investigators are looking into the repair shop and the systems that regulate the robots. Suddenly, a computer announces another upload. A new Alice model opens her eyes, indicating that the nightmare is far from over.